You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Vivienne Nunis, and today we're discussing political advertising. Political ads have long been banned from TV and radio in Britain, except during election campaigns and referendums. Soon, though, you could be seeing a whole lot more. An animal rights group is challenging the ban in the European Court of Human Rights, claiming it violates freedom of expression, guaranteed in the European Convention on Human Rights. If the UK ban is overturned, you could be watching Right to Life ads during Coronation Street, or listening to Conservative Party pitches while you drive to work. But advocates argue charities or political groups should be able to promote their agenda the same way McDonald's or Volkswagen push theirs. And selling an idea or a cause is no different from selling life insurance or the latest hair loss treatment. Joining me to discuss the ban on political advertising in Britain is Ben Harris-Quiney, chairman of the conservative think tank The Bow Group, and Stephen Tall, the co-editor of Liberal Democrat Voice. On the phone is Dr Matthew Ashton, a lecturer in politics at Nottingham Trent University, and the broadcaster and journalist Julian Bray. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
To begin this discussion, I'd like to go right to the heart of the claim being made by Animal Defenders International at the European Court of Human Rights. The group made an advertisement campaigning against the use of performing apes, but it wasn't allowed to be broadcast in Britain. Animal defenders say that's a limit on their right to freedom of expression. So I'd like to ask each of you, does the UK's blanket ban on TV and political advertising curtail freedom of expression? Ben Harris-Quiney?
I think it does to an extent, and I'm quite relaxed about the possibility of the ban being relaxed. The issue is, will this be a pathway case and actually allow for issues that are seen as more political, more controversial, come onto British screens? And there's a chance of that. I don't think it's particularly a problem, though, because I do believe in the discerning nature of the British television audience in this sense. I don't think we're going to see US-style TV and radio advertising. I just don't think it'd work in Britain. So a case would have to be made to advertisers, I think, to make their broadcasts salient and relevant to a British audience.
OK, Stephen Tall, what's your view?
Well, for me, I think the TV advertising ban is almost a side issue, because the bigger issue for me is about the party political funding and whether or not it's money that talks when it comes to the political debate in this country. So whether it's TV, newspaper, internet, cinema, whatever form of advertising happens is less important to me than the amount of money that needs to be spent. And the problem you have with TV advertising, obviously, is how much more expensive it is. And that's why in the US you have billion-dollar campaigns in which money does have megaphone democracy. So those who have most money get the biggest voice. And that's what worries me about it. But I'm not worried about TV advertising itself per se. I think if you have some form of cap on the amount that can be spent within political debate, then that answers the question. And it's up then to the political parties and campaigning organisations themselves to decide whether their £1 million would be better spent on one 30-second ad during Downton Abbey, or whether actually that would be better spent sending 2 million targeted leaflets to households. That's their choice. But I think the important thing is that you actually have a level playing field when it comes to the information that is available to the public that allows them to make up their minds.
Getting back to whether or not it curtails freedom of expression, though, Dr Matthew Ashton, do you think it does?
I think it does to a certain extent, but sometimes there are good reasons for limiting freedom of expression. And I think my greatest fear in all of this is simply the fact that we could slowly, not overnight, turn into the USA, where much of the advertising is very, very negative, a lot of it's untrue, and there's a certain amount of evidence that shows that people over there are becoming more disengaged as a result of that. And I think there is a big problem as well about how you regulate it, because Britain has not got a great reputation or history with stuff like the ASA and Ofcom of being very good at regulating its own media.
Political participation in Britain, though, is also quite low. Since 2001, voter turnout has averaged around 62%. Wouldn't some political party advertising on TV all of the time cause a little bit better engagement on some level?
I think it might make people angrier, not necessarily better informed. I mean, I've just come back from the USA, and I spend an awful lot of time out there watching these TV adverts and making notes for a research project of mine at the moment. And after watching them, it was pretty much wall to wall. I certainly felt angry about the issues. I'm not necessarily sure I actually knew the facts.
What about you, Julian Bray? Would you agree with that point there? Do you think it would be a danger of Britain turning into the US in terms of political TV advertising if this ban was overturned?
Not at all, because the situation here in the UK is we've got a totally different system to that exists in the USA. And I do broadcast on many radio stations across the States. And you have to realise that we do have Ofcom, and despite what your correspondent says, Ofcom is really quite strict with TV broadcasters. Now, also, you have to realise this actually extends to local television broadcasting, and you have local TV stations coming in. So this idea of spending £1 million on the 32nd for Downton Abbey, frankly, just is silly, because what you're looking at is local issues being debated on all possible media. At the moment, you've got a local newspaper industry that's in tatters. Our local one, for example, in Peterborough, where I come from, has just gone weekly. So we have a once-a-week local paper, which is frankly frightened to upset the council because that will cut off all sources of news as far as they're concerned. And that's the situation. For example, we have an incinerator debate at the moment, and the Tories on the council are trying to force this issue through. A lot of people don't want it, but the whole problem is not being aired properly. Now, if we had television advertising for it, we could get these issues over. It's not going to be like America, because the Saatchis, if you remember, with the Labour Isn't Working ads way back in the 70s, and the Tories with their other ads, actually managed to get it over in a really British way. Not like the American TV advertising, but it was punchy, good, British-style advertising.
Dr Matthew Ashton, I'll ask you to come in there then. Isn't there a way that we could have political advertising allowed in Britain with some regulation that would stop Britain turning into America?
I think if it's well regulated, that's a possibility. I mean, another issue relating to that is simply the fact that you could argue it's an irrelevance as more and more people have TV set-top boxes, Sky or whatnot. Most of the people I know don't really watch advertising anymore because they can just fast-forward through it. And that, I think, is the wave of the future. There's also the issue of the fact that a lot of people, when they see these adverts, more and more money is being sort of focused on putting them online and targeted advertising.
That's the point I'm definitely going to come back to later. For now, though, I'd like to go to a quote from Tamsin Allen, who's the animal defender's lawyer. She says, commercial companies are free to advertise their products no matter how controversial they are, but charities and campaign groups may not. Isn't that fundamentally unfair? Stephen Tall.
I'm sure it will seem that way to them, and you can understand why. I mean, I guess what it's trying to ensure is that you don't have loopholes which the US has exposed, where you have PACs and super PAC organisations able to fund political causes by the back door, and so evade the idea that there should be a political funding cap. I just want to come back very briefly to Julian's point earlier that it's silly to say that there would be £1 million 30-second ad during Downton Abbey or whatever else happens to be on at the time. Go back to the 2008 election, and President Obama, as he then was Governor Obama, spent $6 billion on one single commercial aired across 3 US networks. So the idea that it would all be local TV advertising isn't correct. The point is money talks, and that's what we've seen throughout political history. And my fear is that if money talks, then it's the people who have the money that will be able to talk loudest, and the people who don't have money will get crowded out.
Yeah, but I think there's a point that runs against that, which is that in the UK, the Conservative Party spent £13 million on the last election. The whole election, I think the spending was 30 million in total. That compares to the current US election, which is probably going to run to about $2.5 billion. British political parties, partly because of the funding, the donor cap, but also I think there's just not such a culture of giving in the UK. For those reasons, British political parties couldn't afford to run an ad for Downton Abbey or any other primetime TV.
And couldn't rules be put in place to cap the amount of spending on political advertising?
Well, I agree with Stephen, actually, that the more relevant rules are the caps on donations to political parties, which are already in effect. Now, if a political party did want to go ahead and spend £1 million on one advert, I guess they could, but it would be a disproportionate use of funds when, as was touched on, people absorb their media in so many different ways now, online, indeed, leaflet campaigns, banner campaigns, local newspaper campaigns, I think it would be a disproportionate use of funds.
Julian Bray, you wanted to jump in there.
Simply, this whole idea about TV being national in the UK is totally wrong, because ITV is actually divided up into regions. So the ads you're seeing in Meridian won't be the same as the ads that you're seeing on Anglia.
That's true, but the costs are the same or relatively similar.
Well, yes, you can do it that way, but surely what you do, you then focus on local issues. You'd have your national issues, but really where it's going, it's becoming so fragmented. And at the moment, we actually have a coalition government, which showed that all the advertising that the Tories put into the last election didn't really work. They've got the worst of all worlds. They're in bed, if you like, uncomfortably with the Lib Dems. And we've now publicly got the Lib Dems looking for an alliance possibly with Labour. So how's that going to pan out? How on earth do you put that into an advertising campaign? I think you find that the political parties aren't nearly so powerful now as they used to be. The current financial situation in the country basically means that donations will dry up. So you have to find more effective ways of doing things. But if we get back to this original case, political advertising could be coming to the UK screens because of Europe, I think you have to realize that we will cut our cloth accordingly. And if it is said that you can actually advertise politically, I will certainly use it for various causes that I support. And I would advise anybody to have a close look at radio, television. It might be local, it might be regional. Whatever the issue is, you will always find the best value for your money to get the most targeted reach. Somebody mentioned local newspaper advertising. Well, I've already pointed out that local newspapers now are driving people to websites because, quite rightly, people are flipping through the ads. They're not really reading newspapers these days, but you find a lot of local newspaper groups are running video now, and they're running video ads on their websites. And that's the future. They see it for iPads and TiVos and things like that. So that, I think, you might find is where it's going to go.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London, where today we're discussing the ban on political advertising in the UK. Joining me in the studio is Stephen Tall, the co-editor of Liberal Democrat Voice, and Ben Harris-Quiney, chairman of the conservative think tank, the Bow Group. On the phone is broadcaster and journalist Julian Bray and Dr Matthew Ashton, a lecturer in politics at Nottingham Trent University. One of the fears with introducing political advertising into the UK seems to be about a situation that's in America being replicated here, and that the tone of the political debate would be lowered. Isn't it true, though, that we already have no rules regulating political advertising on billboards, and some could argue that even in the tabloid press the political debate isn't so highbrow? Isn't it a bit of a double standard then, ruling out TV and radio ads?
Yeah, I think so. People absorb their media via so many different sources now. TV and radio is not as significant as it used to be. So if you have a ban on TV and radio, but not online, not in billboards, not in local leafleting campaigns, not in local newspapers or indeed national newspapers, then it looks bizarre, because why is this particular media group being isolated? I don't think there's any reason for that anymore. It's not as significant as it used to be, and I don't see any reason why not relax the laws on those media groups as well.
Do you agree, Stephen Tall?
Yeah, I think I do, and I think we're in danger of agreeing with each other too much here. But I think the point is, TV is just one of many media now. There is a greater plurality. The idea that these rules were created back when you had, well, in fact, only 2 or 3 terrestrial channels, and that was how the public consumed its news. That's not disappeared. It's still very relevant. In fact, we saw that very much at the last election, when the first televised leaders' debate ever in UK history caused Cleggmania to happen, and so on. So TV definitely has a power that outranks any other medium at the moment, but it is becoming a much more complex, plural picture. So I don't think it's a question of that we shouldn't relax the rules. In fact, probably the interesting one is how you start to regulate it in a way that is fair to all parties. We've mentioned the fact that you would need to make sure there was some form of regulation. At the moment, the ASA, the Advertising Standards Authority, the Electoral Commission, doesn't regulate political advertising. We saw that in the alternative vote referendum last year, which became very disputed and contentious between the yes and no sides about the claims being made. And there was no power to regulate, no power to, in a sense, fact check or ask the organisations making their claims, is that correct? Can you point to some evidence, regardless of your ideology, can you point to some evidence that it's correct? So I think the real issue here is, yes, of course, TV advertising should be allowed. I think it goes hand in hand with making sure there are limits on overall campaign expenditure. And then you have the question about how you can regulate it to be fair to all sides.
Dr Matthew Ashton, is there a way TV advertising could be regulated so it is fair?
I think it's possible, but it would be difficult. And again, in this country, we've not got a great history in terms of regulating the media. I mean, the Press Complaints Commission, I think, is a good evidence of that sometimes. However, again, coming back to this point...
That's not advertising, though, is it? You're talking about editorial now.
Well, I mean, to give an example...
Advertising Standards Authority regulate press advertising. So I'm afraid you're mixing apples with pears.
Well, no,
we do actually have a fairly good regime. Ofcom is actually quite hard on the television companies, so I don't know where you're getting these facts from.
Well, no, to give an example from, the referendum, there was a case where people complained about advertisements, and the ASA said it's nothing to do with us, and they took it to Ofcom, and Ofcom said, well, it's nothing to do with us. So I think there is a gap in the regulatory market there that needs to be looked at. But in terms of the Internet, that is unregulated, and people have really struggled with regulating it anyway. In America, what's increasingly happening is a lot of the adverts, the TV adverts that are making a huge impact, aren't even really shown on TV, or they're shown in very, very local markets. For instance, Herman Cain's Smoking Man advert from last year, all they did was show it on their YouTube channel, and it caused such a fuss and commotion because it was seen to be vaguely controversial. All of the regular news sites, the TV stations, the newspapers, picked up on it and then showed it endlessly on their TV stations.
Well, this is called viral marketing, isn't it?
I think that increasingly will be the name of the game.
Rather than TV advertising, which is, of course, is a topic of debate. And I think you've got to look at this. You've really got to take, well, when you say, for example, that internet advertising going on the internet is not regulated. Now, I run a blog, and I'm regularly getting lawyers' letters and things. There is a thing called the Defamation Act, 1965, and that regulates it quite well. And we've also got Leveson looking at the overall picture. But be assured there is a regulatory framework there. Either you self-regulate or you find that the lawyers will do it for you. So
what about Twitter and the super injunctions last year? They attempted to regulate that. I think Ryan Giggs tried to sue Twitter, and it didn't work in that case.
But it doesn't work in all cases, to be fair. But especially in the blogosphere, which is another form of advertising, if you like, or publicity, there's quite a bit of case law building up in there. So we're a bit more worried about that than advertising on television. And I can't really see American-style ads coming over here because our advertising has always been different from American advertising. We're more ironic over here. We can actually see the joke and we see the wider picture. Whereas in America, it is a very hard sell indeed.
Ben Harris-Quiney, you don't think American-style political ads will work in Britain either?
No, I don't. Although I do think that the British consume a lot of American media, but they use a filter when they're doing so. I think it's recognised that this is American, and therefore it should be viewed under a slightly different light. In the UK as well, I think it wouldn't work. Although local advertising has been mentioned, we have nowhere near the amount of local TV stations in the UK as they have in the United States. And I think that makes it far more difficult to engage with local issues. I mean, you can talk about Anglia TV and sort of these big regional TV stations or media groups, but it's nothing like in the United States where you'd have a TV station for a town and you're able to really engage with specific local issues. So I don't think it would work in that way either.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London, where we're discussing the case for and against political advertising in the UK. What about the wider cause then that this animal defenders group is pushing? If we move away from party political ads, U2 singer Bono has an organisation called One, and he wanted to broadcast an ad with a string of Hollywood stars campaigning for political leaders to act on famine in the Horn of Africa. Now, that ad wasn't allowed to be broadcast either because of the pressure it was putting on political leaders to act. Ofcom ruled that was a breaching of the rules. Shouldn't we be allowed to see a broader range of issues rather than just corporate interests?
Well, of course, charities are allowed to advertise already if they qualify under the Charity Commission rules, and they are there for the public benefit. What doesn't qualify are these campaigning organisations, small p, I suppose, political organisations where they're pushing a particular line. I think that's because of the fear that it would be party political funding by the back door. But I think you're right. But you've also got the other issue, which is that we do actually allow some campaigning, policy-pushing adverts on TV. The BBC regularly advertises the licence fee and says what terrific value it is. That is a party political, almost, issue, which it is allowed to spend money, state money, on filming the adverts and then broadcasting the adverts. You have Her Majesty's government also able to use public information films to push particular policies using free airtime and state-funded sources of advertising as well. So you do have it already within a state system. What you don't have the ability for is campaigning organisations which don't have the backing of the government or the state to be able to do the same thing. And so I would, as a Liberal, I would say that they should have the same kind of rights as state-funded organisations to be able to push their line.
I agree wholeheartedly, yeah. There's the other kind of political advertising, I suppose, in the UK, which is the party political broadcast. And whilst I think that's perfectly acceptable, the problem with the party political broadcast is it does give undue exposure to the biggest political parties. And I think actually it's quite likely that if you open up TV and radio advertising to all political groups, all political parties, you're probably going to see a proportional rise in the smaller political parties advertising, where in the past they've been prevented from doing so because I think the qualification is for party political broadcast it relates to the amount of candidates being run in an upcoming election or the amount of seats that party has in Parliament, which of course means that a lot of voices aren't heard.
Okay, I'm just going to go to a clip now. You'll recognise it, I'm sure.
Then to know that Reverend Al Green was here. I'm so in love with you.
That, of course, is the dulcet tones of President Obama singing Al Green during a speech at a fundraising event in New York. Now, as we were touching on before, that clip went instantly viral and millions of people have seen that footage online. If so many people are getting their advertising and then political messages through online social media these days, isn't TV and radio old hat and the real way to reach the electorate through social media where no rules apply?
I don't think it's old hat. I think it offers poor value for money, as discussed. But there was an interesting issue actually in the UK where London buses were running. There were three campaigns that I recall specifically. One was the Richard Dawkins-led campaign, "What if there is no God?" The other was some people are homosexual, get over it, and the other was some people aren't homosexual, get over it, or something of that nature. And what happened was those three campaigns became very heavily covered in the news media. I think that made them more relevant. But of course, they weren't TV campaigns. They were just very heavily covered by the TV news media. So that made them far more relevant. And I'm sure in the case of the Al Green clip and many YouTube clips that go viral, I think the Conservative Party's most famous one is probably Dan Hannon's in the European Parliament, the devalued Prime Minister speech that he gave to Gordon Brown. They become referenced on the news and therefore are actually very good value advertising because they cost nothing to produce, and then the global news media pick them up and show them on television for free.
Those three ads you mentioned that were on the buses, though, those ads, I understand, would be allowed to be broadcast on TV because they wouldn't have been breaching of the political rules as they stand at the moment, would they?
No, I don't think those issues would have been allowed under the 2003 Communications Act. Because I think although they are not necessarily connected to a political party, they are inherently political. I don't know if you have a comment on that, Stephen, if you think they would have been allowed.
Yeah, no, I'm pretty sure that's the case, that anything that is political, small p political, is subject to the same kind of ban, which is exactly why the Animal Defenders International campaigning group are aggrieved. And I understand why. They want to put their point across. I think they're probably naive because I suspect they feel that if enough people get to hear about their cause, they will ensure that everyone is instantly converted to believing in their cause. And of course what you will actually find is that those people with more money than the Animal Defenders International have will be able to put up adverts straight away countermanding their particular point of view. So I'm going to come back to the point that money talks, and it definitely does when it comes to advertising. And so I think those charities, even if they're quite big in their own right, you think of Oxfam and UNICEF and Amnesty International, those kind of campaigning organisations, if they think actually that it's suddenly going to be able to they're going to be able to convert vast numbers of people to their cause through a TV spot, I think that's just not likely.
Yes, and it might work against them, remember, because people are actually donating money to these charities. And if your particular charity gets very hung up on a particular political issue, then of course it might actually affect the number of donations coming in.
We're almost out of time here, but just before we wrap up, I'd just like to ask each of you how you hope the decision or the ruling then is at the European Court of Human Rights. Do we hope the ban on UK political advertising is overturned or not? Ben Harris-Quiney?
I hope that it is overturned. Yeah, I think it would be an interesting progression, but not one that will completely change the way politics operates in the UK.
Stephen Tall?
Yes, I hope it's overturned as well, but I hope that even more what goes hand in hand with that is that the talks that are currently being held between Conservative, Labour and Liberal Democrat MPs yield some results when it comes to sorting out party funding. We've had so many scandals over the last few years where donors who have been caught trying to get advantages for their businesses or for themselves through giving donations has brought politics into disrepute. And so ultimately it's the party funding issue that has to be sorted out. But yeah, sure, let's make sure that anyone who wants to advertise on TV can, as long as it's well regulated.
Julian Bray, do you agree with our studio guests?
I think the brake should be taken off political advertising. And as for politicians and MPs getting together, after all the scandals they've been through and all the problems with money they've had over the last few years, I don't think it's going to be a problem in the future. You've got a much wiser public out there, and they will donate wisely. And if they need to use political advertising to get members into the folds and to join their particular parties, then so be it. And I think you'll find that the advertising industry will respond accordingly and rates will be adjusted accordingly. And just one point, I was visiting a commercial radio station and I said, what is your target audience? They said the female at home, aged 23 to 35. So how about that?
That's not me. Dr Matthew Ashton, what do you think then?
I'm broadly supportive of the idea. I think it would increase the plurality of debate. However, I think it does have to be looked at very carefully in terms of how it's going to be regulated and the impact on the wider technological scene. But I think broadly a good thing.
Sounds like we're all in agreement then. That's all we've got time for today. We'll all be watching with interest to see whether or not the European Court of Human Rights does overturn the ban on political advertising in the UK. That ruling is expected in the coming weeks. For now, though, I'd like to thank all of my guests for taking part in this discussion today. Joining me in the Voice of Russia studio were Ben Harris-Quiney, chairman of the conservative think tank The Bow Group, and Stephen Tall, the co-editor of the Liberal Democrat Voice. On the phone, we had Dr Matthew Ashton, a lecturer in politics at Nottingham Trent University, and the broadcaster and journalist Julian Bray. Thanks to each of you. Stay tuned for the latest from the Voice of Russia newsroom.